She had always attended parent-teacher conferences out of duty more than interest. It was one of those obligatory events, the kind where mothers sip lukewarm coffee from paper cups and feign polite interest, while scanning over charts of attendance, behavior, and performance metrics. That evening had felt no different at first. The halls of the school were oddly quiet, the lingering scent of pencil shavings and disinfectant hanging in the air. She remembered the feeling of her heels clicking against the waxed floors, the hum of faint fluorescent lights overhead, and the way the corridor stretched too long, too sterile. Her son Nathan had always been a quiet boy, studious and withdrawn, more interested in science books than socializing. She had come to expect that his teachers would praise his work ethic, perhaps mention he needed to open up more. But when she stepped into Mr. Collins's classroom, something shifted. He stood up immediately, a man in his mid-30s, dressed just slightly more neatly than the others. No tie, but a pressed shirt with sleeves rolled up in a way that seemed deliberate rather than casual. His eyes held her a second too long before he gestured toward the seat across from his desk. There was warmth in his voice, but also something else, an ease, a smoothness that made her instinctively straighten in her chair. The way he said her name was slow and precise, as if trying it out. She watched him closely, noting the relaxed way he leaned back in his chair, the casual but intentional placement of his hands as he opened Nathan's file. He spoke about her son in glowing terms, articulate, attentive, a joy to have in class. But the conversation drifted quickly away from Nathan. He asked about her, about how she was adjusting to her son's transition into high school. He mentioned her by her first name again. She smiled politely, told herself it was normal, that teachers often try to connect with parents. But the way he looked at her didn't feel like professional curiosity. There was something in his eyes she couldn't place, something that studied her, memorized her, rather than simply noticed. She was wearing something modest, a plain navy blouse and slacks, her hair still slightly damp from rushing to get ready after work. And yet his gaze felt like a spotlight. As he spoke, his fingers drummed lightly against the folder, then paused as if considering something. He closed it gently and leaned forward slightly. The words that followed were still about Nathan technically, but his tone had changed. He spoke slower now, more intimately. He said Nathan had potential, but sometimes potential needed encouragement. That it would be a shame if he didn't reach it fully. She wasn't sure what he meant. The phrases were vague, harmless on the surface, but they were said with too much weight. Each word felt dipped in suggestion. She nodded absently, her posture stiffening, a strange unease building in her gut. She caught herself glancing at the clock on the wall, unsure if time was passing too quickly or too slowly. When the meeting ended, he walked her to the door of the classroom. She thanked him for his time, and as she turned to go, he touched her elbow lightly, a brief, lingering contact that sent a ripple through her spine. She told herself again that it meant nothing. She left quickly, avoiding the eyes of other parents still waiting in the hallway. The entire drive home she replayed the conversation in her head, trying to convince herself that she had imagined the tone, the subtle tension. She didn't want to be the type of person who saw threats where there were none, who read into things that weren't there. But there was something about his demeanor, his smile, the way his eyes followed her, that she couldn't quite forget. It wasn't until she got home and began unpacking her purse that the feeling turned into certainty. Her keys were at the bottom along with her wallet and phone, but something else was there, something foreign. A folded piece of white paper, not crumpled, not old. Her fingers hesitated before pulling it out. There was no name on the outside. No indication of where it had come from. She unfolded it slowly, her breath catching as her eyes scanned the words. They weren't explicit. In fact, they were maddeningly vague. A suggestion, a compliment, a hint, a line that read, "Some people know how to ask for help without saying a word. I can help too." It didn't say anything directly about Nathan. It didn't say anything about grades. But it didn't have to. The message was clear, because it had been handed to her, not spoken. Because it had been hidden in her purse like a secret. Because it hadn't come with a signature or even a name. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded the paper again. For a moment she just stared at it, sitting on the table in front of her. A voice inside her said to throw it away. Another told her to call someone. But she did neither. She simply sat down at the kitchen table, the silence of the house closing in, and stared at the paper like it held a mirror to something she didn't want to see. Her heart beat faster, not from fear but from confusion. From the understanding that something had just begun. Something she hadn't agreed to but hadn't stopped either. She didn't know what she would do next. All she knew was that she would not forget the way he had looked at her. Or the way his note had made her feel, violated, yes, but also seen. And that feeling, dangerous as it was, would linger much longer than she wanted to admit. The following morning was filled with a quiet tension she couldn't explain. The paper note remained exactly where she had left it, on the edge of the kitchen counter, perfectly folded as if untouched. But its presence seemed to infect the air around it. She found herself glancing toward it every few minutes, unable to ignore the weight it now held over her thoughts. It was just a few words, no names, no explicit requests, and yet it had shattered the normalcy of her life in one simple gesture. She tried to go about her routine, making breakfast for Nathan, reminding him about his packed lunch, grabbing her coffee on the way out, but the ordinary felt off. Her movements were mechanical, each task performed under a thick fog of distraction. She drove Nathan to school without mentioning the meeting or the note. He sat beside her, humming softly to the music playing from the radio, oblivious to the chaos brewing in her mind. He was so innocent, so unaware of the undercurrents now rippling just beneath the surface of his school life. When he got out of the car and disappeared into the flow of other students, she felt a deep pang of guilt. She should have told someone at the school, the principal, the district board, even the police. But what would she say? That a teacher put a vague note in her purse? That it suggested something, but didn't really say anything? She would be dismissed or worse, seen as someone seeking attention. She knew how institutions worked, how easily words could be twisted, turned into misunderstandings. And she had no proof, only intuition, and a few haunting lines of handwriting. She went through her workday with little recollection of what she accomplished. Coworkers greeted her. She responded. Emails were read and replied to. Meetings attended, deadlines noted. But her mind remained fixed on the folded paper. On Mr. Collins's face. On that long look across the desk. It wasn't just the content of the note that disturbed her. It was the fact that it had been done so quietly, so effortlessly, as if this was a routine for him, as if she were simply next. That thought chilled her more than anything. The possibility that she wasn't special, that this had happened before. Or that he knew exactly the kind of mother to target. Divorced, tired, alone, vulnerable. When she returned home that evening, the silence in the house felt oppressive. Nathan was at his friend's house for a project, so she was alone. She poured herself a glass of wine she didn't want, sat at the kitchen table, and finally unfolded the note again. The words hadn't changed, but her understanding of them had deepened. Some people know how to ask for help without saying a word. I can help too. It was condescending, manipulative, and carefully phrased. But there was an undercurrent of demand beneath the guise of kindness. It wasn't just about her. It was about control. He was testing her, seeing how far he could go. And she hadn't stopped him. Her first instinct had been shame, then fear. But now, sitting under the dim kitchen light, what crept in was something darker. Curiosity. She hated that feeling, but it surfaced anyway. What would he have done if she responded? What exactly was he offering in exchange for his help? Would he try again? Would he be bolder next time? That's what scared her most. That deep, unspoken part of her that didn't want it to end there. She justified it by telling herself that she needed more information, that she needed to be sure before doing anything rash. But part of her wanted another note. Another sign. Something more direct. That night she dreamed of the classroom again, not as it had been but dimly lit, empty, filled with echoes. Mr. Collins was there, but he didn't speak. He simply stood, watching her from behind his desk, as if waiting for her to act. She woke up in a sweat, her heart pounding and the note still on the nightstand beside her. She reached for it again, reading the words like a confession. There was no name, no contact, just implication. But implication, when left unchecked, could become real. The next day, she lingered outside Nathan's school longer than usual. Parents were coming and going, kids streaming past. But her eyes scanned the crowd, looking for a familiar face. She wasn't sure if she wanted to see him or not. But when Mr. Collins finally emerged, talking to another parent, his expression was easy, confident, untouched. He didn't even look in her direction. That stung more than she expected. She had spent 2 days haunted by his gesture, dissecting his every word and look, while he carried on as if nothing had happened. That imbalance of power hit her like a wave. He had planted the seed, and now he was watching, maybe even enjoying, her reaction from a distance. Still, she said nothing. She went home, cleaned the house obsessively, erased every fingerprint from her surfaces, every sign of disorder, as if by restoring her environment she could restore her peace. But there was no peace. Just the creeping dread that this was only the beginning, that he had chosen her for a reason, that the next note might not be so vague. And worse, that part of her might not resist it. She spent the next few days in a haze of conflicting emotions, each one pulling her in a different direction. Her instincts screamed at her to take the note to someone, anyone, who could do something about it. But her hesitation held her back like invisible chains. Every time she pictured herself walking into the principal's office or contacting the school board, she imagined the same outcome: disbelief, dismissal, embarrassment. She would become the over-imaginative mother with a grudge, or worse, someone accused of fabricating a story. And she wasn't even sure how she would explain it. The note was vague. It never said anything outright. It relied on the reader's interpretation. And she had read into it, maybe too deeply, maybe exactly as he had intended. At night, she began rereading the message like it was a puzzle, searching for clues in the curves of the letters, the spacing, the slight smudge at the edge where his finger must have pressed the paper. She began noticing things in her day-to-day life that reminded her of him. The way a man at the grocery store lingered near her in the wine aisle. The way another held the door open too long, looking just a little too intently at her face. It was as if the boundaries of normal interaction had suddenly blurred. Her world felt less safe, less predictable, and strangely more alive. That Friday, as she stood in front of her closet preparing for a school fundraiser, she hesitated over her usual blouse and slacks. Her hand hovered over a dress she hadn't worn in years, soft burgundy, with a neckline slightly lower than she was used to now. It reminded her of a different version of herself, one that felt long buried beneath the responsibilities of motherhood and the quiet grief of divorce. She told herself it was just a dress, just fabric. But as she slipped it on, she felt something shift inside her. A flicker of confidence. Or maybe danger. She looked in the mirror longer than necessary, adjusting a strand of hair, touching her collarbone as if rediscovering it. The school fundraiser was held in the gymnasium, transformed for the evening into a space of folding tables, buffet trays, and forced cheerfulness. Parents milled about, balancing paper plates and plastic cups, making small talk and pretending the fluorescent lights didn't flatten every feature. She smiled at familiar faces, made polite conversation, all the while scanning the room. And then she saw him. Mr. Collins stood near the back, leaning casually against a table, his shirt sleeves rolled once again in that deliberate way. He wasn't looking at her, not yet, but she could feel the pull of his presence like a magnet. When he did turn, his eyes met hers for only a second before he looked away, but the flicker of recognition, of acknowledgement, was undeniable. She told herself to ignore it, to focus on the other parents, to be present for Nathan, who was across the room chatting with friends. But her eyes kept drifting. He didn't approach her, didn't speak. But he didn't need to. The unspoken understanding between them was thicker than any words could have been. The note had planted something, and now it grew in silence. She wondered if he was testing her patience, waiting to see how long she would wait before doing something. Or maybe he was simply letting the idea settle deeper, giving her space to think about what it all meant. After an hour of uneasy mingling, she slipped into the hallway outside the gym to breathe. The air was cooler, quieter. The buzz of conversation behind her was muffled by the walls. She didn't expect anyone to follow, but she heard footsteps. Slow, measured. When she turned, he was there, close but not too close. Just enough for her to feel his presence. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His eyes traveled from her face to the edge of her dress and back again. A small smile played at the corner of his mouth, one that didn't reach his eyes. Then he walked past her, the faintest brush of his arm against hers, and disappeared around the corner. Her breath caught, her pulse racing. She leaned against the wall, confused by the heat that surged through her. It wasn't just fear. It wasn't just guilt. It was something heavier, more personal. He had said nothing and yet said everything. She knew now this wasn't a coincidence. The note, the look, the hallway, it was all intentional. A game of silence and suggestion, where words were less important than behavior. And she had just responded, not by action but by showing up. By wearing the dress. By following the pull. Back home that night, she stood in front of her mirror again, staring at her reflection without knowing what she was looking for. The makeup had faded slightly. Her hair had fallen loose around her shoulders. She looked both older and younger at the same time, like a woman caught between the past and something unfamiliar. She didn't know if she was flattered or disgusted. All she knew was that she hadn't thrown the note away. It was still in her bedside drawer, tucked between receipts and forgotten papers. A secret in plain sight. A whisper she wasn't ready to silence. She lay in bed unable to sleep, her mind racing through every gesture, every glance exchanged. She had never crossed a line, not yet. But it felt like she was already standing on it, toes curled over the edge, waiting for the ground to disappear beneath her. And somewhere, deep in that secret part of herself, she wondered what would happen if she didn't step back. If she let herself fall. She didn't know why she went back to the school that afternoon. There was no event, no scheduled meeting, no formal reason to be there. But something inside her pulled her back. A lingering thread of curiosity tangled with unease. She told herself it was to drop off a forgotten assignment for Nathan. But that wasn't entirely true. The paper sat on the passenger seat of her car as she parked, pristine and untouched. She stared at it for a long time before stepping out, taking a deep breath that felt too shallow. The school grounds were quiet, between the end of classes and the beginning of after-school activities. The hallway lights buzzed faintly, a constant reminder of how empty the building was. She walked slowly, her heels clicking on the tiled floor, every sound magnified in the stillness. As she approached the classroom, her heart began to beat faster, though she told herself there was no reason for it. She stood at the door, hesitating. Inside, the room looked exactly as it had last time. Rows of chairs, clean whiteboards, colorful posters, nothing unusual. But it felt heavier, like the air itself had thickened. He was there behind his desk, alone, organizing a stack of papers. He didn't seem surprised to see her. That unsettled her more than if he had looked shocked. He gestured politely for her to come in, his expression unreadable. She stepped inside cautiously, placing the paper on the edge of his desk. The conversation that followed was brief, neutral. They spoke about Nathan, his participation in group work, his upcoming exam, his improvement in writing. It all sounded so ordinary, almost rehearsed. She nodded, responded when necessary, but her mind wasn't on the words. It was on his posture, the way he leaned forward slightly, the way his fingers tapped rhythmically on the desk. She could feel the tension again, low and steady like a hum beneath the surface. She tried to steer the conversation back to neutral ground, to keep it grounded in safe language. But there were pauses, moments between his sentences that felt stretched too long, where something unsaid hovered in the silence. He didn't bring up the note. Neither did she. But it lingered there like a ghost between them. When she turned to leave, he stood, walking with her toward the door. His presence was calm, even professional, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her more closely than necessary. Outside in the corridor, her steps quickened. She felt as if she had just walked across a wire stretched between two buildings, careful not to lean too far in either direction. There had been no confrontation, no escalation, but there had been intent. It was in his eyes, his quiet, deliberate tone. He knew she hadn't reported him. He knew she had come back. That alone changed the balance between them. He didn't need to say anything else. Not yet. Back in her car, her hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel. She wasn't sure what disturbed her more, the tension of the encounter, or the way a part of her had anticipated it. She hated the thought, but it crept in anyway, that she had returned not just to protect her son's record, but to test something. Herself. Him. The boundary. And now she realized it was thinner than she had expected. The following days passed slowly. She tried to redirect her focus on her work on Nathan, on mundane tasks that used to bring a sense of control. But nothing felt grounded anymore. She began avoiding mirrors, because the reflection that stared back at her didn't feel familiar. It wasn't guilt that consumed her. It was uncertainty. She didn't know what she was becoming. She didn't know how much of her silence was fear, and how much was complicity. She knew now that she stood at a crossroads. One path led back to normalcy, to speaking up, to restoring boundaries that had already begun to erode. The other path was darker, vague and undefined, shaped not by action but by what she allowed to continue. And she hadn't chosen yet. That indecision, more than anything, haunted her the most. The morning air felt heavier than usual, and though the sun filtered through the blinds in soft golden slants, there was no warmth in her kitchen. She stood by the sink with a cup of untouched coffee, staring out at the yard without seeing any of it. Days had passed since she had returned to the school. Days filled with silence, with endless internal dialogue, with a mounting pressure that felt like it was coiling tighter around her ribs. Nothing had happened. Nothing overt, anyway. But everything inside her had shifted. She moved differently now, spoke more cautiously, as though afraid that the weight of what she hadn't done would finally tip over into consequence. She avoided Mr. Collins at every opportunity. She changed the route she took when picking up Nathan. She asked her son vague questions about how things were going in class, hoping that the boy's innocent answers would quiet the noise in her head. But they never did. Nathan was thriving, it seemed. His grades were strong. His assignments were coming back with positive comments. She should have felt relief. Instead, it made her skin crawl. She didn't know if her silence had played a part in that. If this unspoken agreement between her and the teacher had somehow translated into real academic favor. The thought made her nauseous. She didn't want to believe she had allowed her son's performance to become part of some sick dynamic. But she had. By saying nothing, she had allowed it all to happen. The guilt was no longer quiet. It woke with her in the mornings, followed her to the grocery store, lingered while she worked. She caught herself daydreaming. Dangerous, complicated daydreams where she rewrote the story to give herself power, clarity, a voice. In these imagined versions, she stormed into the school, threw the note on the principal's desk, and demanded justice. But in reality, the note remained locked in her desk drawer, sealed inside an envelope she refused to touch. One afternoon, a voicemail from the school triggered her heart into a full sprint. Her breath caught before she even played it. It was a routine message about an upcoming parent-teacher night. But the mention of the school, the fact that she had to return there again, possibly see him again, caused a cold flush to spread across her chest. She sat down on the edge of her bed, phone still in hand, and stared at the floor for several long minutes. She didn't want to go, but she knew she would. On the night of the meeting, she dressed conservatively, deliberately plain. She chose dark colors, minimal makeup, her hair pulled back in a simple twist. She wanted to feel protected, as if armor could be made from fabric and restraint. The school was busy with parents shuffling in and out, voices bouncing off lockers and tile. She walked slowly, checking her schedule, timing her arrival so she wouldn't have to sit in the classroom alone with him. When she stepped inside, another mother was already seated. The relief was so immediate she nearly smiled. Mr. Collins greeted her as though nothing had ever happened. His tone was professional, his demeanor smooth and controlled. He spoke about Nathan, referenced recent projects, mentioned upcoming testing. She nodded, responded, kept her eyes on the papers in front of her. But she felt it. The subtle shift in the air, the familiar tension tightening around the corners of the conversation. He didn't touch her, didn't look at her too long, but the memory of the hallway, the note, the silence hung between them like smoke. After the meeting, she left quickly. Her steps were fast, her breathing shallow. The moment she reached her car, she broke down. Not into tears, not into rage. It was something quieter. A crumbling. A realization. She was not in control. She had let something grow in the shadows, fed by silence and shame, and now it had rooted itself in her life in ways she couldn't easily cut out. She leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes. For a long time she just sat there, engine off, fingers clenched in her lap. Later that night, she opened the drawer and took out the envelope. She held it, stared at it, ran her thumb over the crease. Then she ripped it in half. Then again. And again. The paper fell in torn pieces onto her lap. It should have felt like freedom, like reclaiming control. But instead she felt exposed. That act, though symbolic, didn't erase what had already been done. Destroying the note didn't mean it never existed. It didn't change what she had allowed to take shape between them. Still, she told herself it was a start. A step toward regaining her voice. She would not return to that classroom unless she had to. She would limit contact. She would remind herself that she had choices. That her silence, though deafening, was not permanent. But in the dark, when the house was quiet and sleep refused to come, she wondered if she had already crossed too many invisible lines. If the moment to walk away without consequence had already passed. The weather had shifted overnight. The wind blew harder that morning, sweeping the leaves in tight circles across the driveway as she watched from the front steps with a strange sense of detachment. The world outside had continued moving. School buses still rolled down the street, neighbors still walked their dogs, and children still laughed in clusters by the corners, but inside her, everything felt muted. Hollow. She was tired in a way that sleep couldn't cure. Not just from the fear or the shame, but from the weeks of pretending that none of it mattered. The illusion was cracking. The silence she had built to contain the situation no longer protected her. It suffocated her. Nathan sat at the kitchen table eating cereal, humming softly, flipping through a science magazine he'd picked up from the library. He looked peaceful, unaware of how carefully his mother had constructed this fragile quiet around him. She smiled when he looked up and he smiled back, and that exchange, so ordinary, so pure, struck her in a way she hadn't expected. She turned away quickly, blinking against the burn in her eyes. It wasn't just about her anymore. It never had been. It was about what she was modeling, the boundaries she had failed to protect, the danger she had let creep into their lives disguised as silence. She spent the morning pacing between rooms, unfinished thoughts crashing into each other, looping again and again through the same questions. What if it gets worse? What if it never comes up again? What if someone else becomes his next target? Her conscience twisted under the weight of the unknown. The memory of that note was seared into her. Even though the paper no longer existed, it didn't matter. Its meaning had rooted itself in her, and now it whispered at every turn. She could feel it in the hallway when she passed the school office, in the way her body tensed when the phone rang, in the dreams that turned sour before morning. By noon she had made a decision. Not a bold one, not loud or even final, but a beginning. She sat at her desk, opened her laptop and began writing. Not to the principal, not yet, but to herself. A document. A record. A place to place the truth she had carried alone for too long. She described the first meeting. The tone. The touch. The note. The way it had all been shaped around plausible deniability, the kind of calculated ambiguity that manipulates without technically crossing the line. She wrote slowly, carefully, choosing words that reflected the complexity of what she had experienced. She didn't romanticize it. She didn't dramatize it. She recorded it as it had happened, plainly, truthfully, as a woman who had been confused, then afraid, and finally deeply aware. The writing took hours. She paused often, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, her breath catching on certain memories. But when she finished, she didn't feel lighter. She felt real, like she had stepped out of a fog. She printed the document, placed it in a folder, and locked it in the drawer where the torn pieces of the note had once been. It wasn't a report yet. It wasn't justice. But it was no longer only a secret. That night, she sat in the darkened living room after Nathan had gone to bed, the TV flickering quietly with a show she wasn't watching. Her wine sat untouched on the coffee table. The air felt still, but she knew something had shifted, something subtle but irreversible. She hadn't told anyone. She hadn't exposed him. But she had chosen to no longer hide from herself. That alone was a rupture in the pattern. A few days later, another message came home from the school. This time it was a request for volunteers on the school committee. Her hand trembled slightly as she read it. It was the sort of thing she would normally ignore. But now she felt the pull of obligation. Not to the school, and certainly not to him, but to herself. If she wanted to keep Nathan safe, if she wanted to reclaim the space that had once belonged to her and her son without fear, she had to step into it again. Not hide from it. She signed up. She offered to assist with administrative tasks, something with structure, boundaries, schedules. She made it clear she would prefer to work in groups. She didn't offer explanations. She didn't need to. Her participation would give her control. Presence. She would no longer let the shadows dictate her decisions. Time passed. The meetings began. She saw him in passing sometimes. In hallways. In parking lots. He never acknowledged her beyond a nod. Whatever game he thought he had been playing was over. She gave him nothing. Not her attention. Not her energy. She reclaimed her silence and turned it into distance. Into clarity. The fear didn't vanish. It never does. But it quieted. And in that quiet she found something else. Not closure but resolve. A way forward. A way to stand in her life again without flinching. She still kept the folder. Just in case. But now when she looked at it, it wasn't a symbol of weakness. It was proof of her strength. That she had named what had happened. That she had stopped pretending it wasn't real. And in doing so, had started the long necessary work of becoming whole again.